Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Pandemic Perspectives session, which is titled Routes of Infection, Routes to Safety, Creative Mapping of Human Viral Behaviour on the Bus to Understand Infection Prevention Practices. Tonight's session will be led by the COVID BusTers team, but before I introduce their members, we have a few quick points of housekeeping to go over. So if you are joining us live tonight on Zoom, please ensure that you are muted for the duration of tonight's presentation element, although you are free to have your camera on or off. It's always nice to see happy, smiling faces as you're doing a presentation, people nodding along. It does help. Following the COVID BusTers team's presentation, we will be having an open discussion of the session's topic, and you may ask our presenters a question, respond to something that another attendee has said, or of course, you are free to offer your very own pandemic perspective. If you wish to contribute verbally, please use the raise hand function here on Zoom and unmute yourself when you are invited to speak. Alternatively, you may type your questions, comments, or observations in the chat, and they will be shared on your behalf. Either way, just a quick sort of reminder to please be respectful. I'm sure everybody will be, but just put it out there. If you are watching this video recording online, we hope you enjoy what promises to be an incredibly fascinating and multidisciplinary discussion. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment, you know, all that lovely stuff that people do say online these days. Anyway, with all that housekeeping out of the way, please allow me to introduce tonight's presenters. We are delighted to be joined by the COVID BusTers team. Now, the COVID BusTers team includes Dr Charlotte Veal of the University of Newcastle and Dr Emma Roe, Dr Paul Hurley, and Dr Sandra Wilks, all from the University of Southampton. Now, we'll quickly go through the author bios for the four of you, hopefully at pretty decent pace. So first up, we have Dr Emma Roe, who is the PI, and Dr Emma Roe is an associate professor in human geography at the University of Southampton. Emma is a leading transdisciplinary scholar developed from her core concerns in more than human geographies. She is comfortable working with those outside her discipline: veterinary science, food science, health science, rural studies, anthropology, sociology, and economics, on research around animal welfare and ethics, commercialization of the non-human, and microbial and viral geographies. Dr Sandra Wilks, who is the co-I, is a lecturer in medical microbiology, principal investigator of microbiology and health sciences, and assistant director of the environmental healthcare unit at the University of Southampton. Sandra is interested in the detection, understanding, and control of biofilms on medical devices and within the clinical environment. She is also working on several projects involved with improving anti-biofilm strategies and COVID-19 in different environments. Next up, we have Dr Charlotte Veal, who is a co-investigator, and Charlotte is a lecturer in landscape architecture at Newcastle University. Charlotte's interdisciplinary research focuses on the intersections between bodies, landscape, and security. She's interested in the techniques and technologies by which bodies are governed and made secure, and she is concerned with the non-human in advancing our sense-making of the world and decentering human agency in the Anthropocene. Her research spearheads creative research methods in the tackling of global challenges. And last but by no means least, we have Dr Paul Hurley, who is a senior research fellow in geography and environmental science at the University of Southampton. Paul is interested in interdisciplinary research, public engagement, and creative projects that investigate how we approach more than human worlds. These are variously in the contexts of ecology, antimicrobial resistance, animal welfare, and food systems and practices. Now, thank you all so much for listening to the preamble, and I hope that was sufficient. I will now pass over to our presenters this evening for the beginning of tonight's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liam, for that lovely introduction. That's like a very wordy introduction. So I think Paul is going to share the screen. He's going to run the slideshow. So to begin, the interdisciplinary project, Routes of Infection, Routes to Safety, began in January 2021, bringing together the disciplines of cultural geography, landscape studies, microbiology, and performance art. We argue to the funders that given the large reduction in public transport use during the COVID-19 pandemic and government and public concerns about the safety of bus travel and being a bus driver during this period, more was needed to understand everyday bus user viral relations in order to make longer term improvements to infection prevention practices on the bus and public transport settings more widely. So at the beginning, some sectors of the economy were identified to have higher rates of death involving COVID-19, including taxi drivers and chauffeurs and bus and coach drivers. In March 2021, the BBC reported that London bus drivers died with COVID-19 at almost 3 times the national average for other occupations, with at least 51 drivers losing their lives at the start of the pandemic. Whilst it's difficult to prove infection transmission took place whilst working on the bus rather than the mess room, a shared car, or domestic household, these were still worrying figures that suggested a wider trend. Evidence from aeronautical engineers studying airflows around a bus driver's cabin indicated how vulnerable drivers were to receiving air with a potentially high COVID viral load from boarding passengers. No similar study on the airflows around the bus saloon have been released into the public domain. Coupled with this, during the first lockdown in April 2020, bus passenger numbers initially dropped by 89 to 90% when compared to the previous year. And comparing the 12 months from June 2019 to 20 and June 20 to 21, there was a 38% decrease in local bus passenger journeys. So what now seems very early in the pandemic, the Campaign for Better Transport argued in the summer of 2020 for the importance of a strong, safe and accessible public transport network as vital to a green post-pandemic recovery. This, conjoined with repeated calls over recent years for the role of improved local public transport to address broader inequalities that were exacerbated by the pandemic, brings an urgency to address how bus user behaviour of drivers, cleaners and passengers can improve infection prevention, not only for SARS-CoV-2, but also other endemic pathogenic viruses like flu and norovirus. So in this presentation, we're firstly going to introduce our conceptual interests to frame the way we have approached methodologically the study and shaped what we see as significant findings. And secondly, to set the microbiological scene on the bus, Sandra Wilks will introduce her methods and the findings from her part of the project. And then thirdly, developing and integrating Sandra's findings into the project, we outline the research aims of this talk, which really just scratches the surface, and findings from ethnography and interviews that we did, that it relate explicitly to the challenge of applying everyday cultures of responding to dirt and its complex relation to infection risk to the novel challenges of SARS-CoV-2. Making clean a response to aesthetic cues, sensations of yuckiness, whether focusing on dirty surfaces or viral-laden air, is understood as a negotiation in a public space where bus users are often disempowered. Bus users not only do not know where an imminent risk lies, but must also negotiate sociocultural and economic barriers to their capacity to respond and reduce personal and collective risk. We will end the presentation with creative outputs from the research in the form of 4 videos that we will discuss hopefully in the Q&A. The films put into practice our manifesto about a need to engage bus users differently to improve infection prevention practices, because we are never alone on the bus. So moving on to the conceptual framework. I'm not sure how many of you are going to be familiar with these concepts, but let's see, not knowing your disciplinary backgrounds. Conceptually, we work with affect theory and more than human microbial, bacterial and viral agencies. So therefore, our work grapples with how immaterialities, materialities, sensations, cultural knowledges, economics and politics affect how our embodied bus user research participants act, think and respond to the novel infection prevention experiences that the pandemic brought into their lives. So race, gender and class cannot be overlooked as we seek to explore the different capacities and relationalities of our research participants to respond to information and advice related to preventing or reducing their risk of infection during the pandemic as bus users. It is well documented how marginal communities are often dependent on public transport, in particular local bus services to access work, shops, family, leisure, schools. Indeed, this certainly seemed the case for many of our research participants. This means we must be sensitive to intersectionality between class, gender, and race when attending to the prehensive forces or intensities of sensation and feelings that interplay between the viral risk and objects like grab handles, decisions to board the bus, wearing a mask, upstairs seating, downstairs seating, front seats, back seats, opening windows, that each holds the capacity to move people behaviourally and emotionally in the playing out of situated capacities to implement COVID infection prevention practices. For it's important to acknowledge the complex and interconnected relational responses to the affordances of the more than human world that will always intersect with race, gender, and class to find expression in BUS users' embodied ethical practice within their effective mode of being. So by this, we're kind of recognising BUS users embody an ethical practice of care for the self and care for others, but which is shaped by pre-personal capacities. Turning now to the microbiological. So now Sandra will tell us about how practices of infection prevention are entangled into values, beliefs, and performances about how and where one is making clean. So over to you, Sandra.
Thanks, Emma. So I want to take a step back and just give a little bit of information to begin with about the fact that we're surrounded by microbes all the time. I thought, as I'm used to seeing microbes all the time, I thought I'd surround myself with microbes all the time in my background. And basically for a microbiologist, we're very aware of the microorganisms that surround us. It's definitely a microbial world. But for many people, they're not so aware of this huge population and communities that exist around us. And so just to give a reflection of the extent of this, first of all, if we think of microorganisms as being the first forms of life that evolved on Earth approximately 3.5 billion years ago, and we can now find them in every environment you can think of, from deep sea vents where there's incredibly high temperatures, to glaciers in the Arctic and Antarctic, from subsurface rock formations actually within the rocks themselves, to clouds high in the atmosphere. We've been able to isolate microorganisms, and certainly from the soil that surround us everywhere, to every environment that we share in our homes, our offices, our vehicles, our air, and on and in us. But we still don't fully understand the diversity of all the microorganisms that we're surrounded by. We don't know what exactly is there, and we don't know how many are there. But some studies have tried to make some estimates. So I'm giving some examples from a variety of studies from recent years. So these are just to try and get some idea of these huge numbers that we're talking about. So it's been estimated that there are 100 million times as many bacteria in just our oceans as there are stars in the known universe, which in itself is quite mind-boggling. If we think of viruses, there's an estimated 10 to the 31 viruses in existence. So that's 1 with 31 zeros. I have no idea what that number is called, but it's very big. And if we laid all those viruses end to end, the distance would stretch for 100 million light years. In our bodies, we have a large number of human cells, as we would expect, but there have now been several studies showing that there are estimated to different levels a larger proportion of microbial cells. So as I always say to my students, you can think of us in a way as more microbial than human, which is also sometimes a little unsettling, but a strange concept. And if you think of the large number in our gut and on our skin in particular. And not only do these microorganisms exist in isolation individually, but they can also form complex communities, complex structures, and we can have things called biofilms forming. So a biofilm is where you can have groups of microorganisms of many species, and there can be bacteria, fungi, viruses, and they work together as a single entity. And the bacteria in a biofilm can produce substances which act as a glue or as a scaffold and create a 3D structure. So what you end up with is a kind of microbial city where you can have defined communication routes, you can have systems transporting food and water around the whole community. And one of the first biofilms that was described was dental plaque, and it's kind of late in the day. If you run your tongue over your teeth, it probably feels a little bit rough. That's the beginning of a biofilm forming. And if we look at dental plaque, if we take a gram, which is a huge amount of plaque, that would never happen in an individual mouth, but they can contain up to 10 to the 11 bacteria, which is approximately the same as the total number of humans who have ever lived. And if we think of air, it's estimated that we're breathing in between 100,000 to 1 million microorganisms every day. And within that, there can be over 1,000 different species, with over 700 always being present wherever we take the samples. So we're surrounded by microorganisms all the time. So we will always share ourselves, our spaces, and our air with microorganisms. If I can move on to the next slide, that's great. But it's far more than thinking about good bugs and bad bugs like we tend to see on adverts, for either we're killing things or we're adding good bugs to our gut to help us stay healthy. Microorganisms are essential to life in all kinds of ways. So they impact on several global processes and cycling. They have implications in climate change. We exploit them in many different industrial processes, from wastewater treatment to food production. Exposure to microorganisms strengthens and improves our immune system response. They produce a whole range of compounds that we need for metabolism, and they can offer us protection. So they're really essential to us as well. And only about 1,500 of the pathogens, so disease-causing microorganisms that we know of, and this can be disease-causing in terms of animal, human, or plant, so it's only around 1,500. And in terms of human pathogens, these only represent about 1,000 of all the microbial species that have been described. So a very small proportion are actually dangerous to us. So in general, we need to be able to understand this invisible community and help people to understand that we don't need to create a sterile world. What we need to do is understand risk, but it's very difficult when you're trying to explain something that most people don't see. For myself as a microbiologist, I have spent many, many hours in a dark room with a microscope, and I've seen them. They are visible to me, but for most people, this is an invisible community that is hard to understand and describe. So if we go to our project, we're looking at what's on the bus. So can we look at what community is found on the bus, what microorganisms are surviving on the bus, and what we bring onto the bus? So our aims in this part of the study are to get an understanding of the diversity and prevalence of the bacterial microorganisms that are found on a range of sites around the bus. And we're looking at different materials types, so plastic on the seats, glass on the windows, stainless steel on grab rails, and fabric obviously on the seats as well. We're also looking pre and post cleaning to see how much we get variation through the day, and also linking to differing passenger density. And we're using a range of methods to establish what the community is that's basically living on the bus and what the community is that's being introduced to the bus. Thinking of a virus in particular, and obviously we're looking at the SARS-CoV-2 virus, we're also running tests for the presence of viral particles on these same surfaces. And then providing data to illustrate that we're surrounded by these microbial communities and start opening conversations on how we can understand better our links with them. I'm not going to go through our methods in any detail at all. If anyone would like to know more, please do let me know. Happy to give some more details. But basically, we're using a validated swab technique to sample sites on a number of buses. So on each bus, we swab the same sites and the same areas so we can make comparisons. Once we have our swabs, we release the bacteria and viruses into a solution, and we can then analyze this in different ways. So for bacteria, we analyze them by culture, where we take our samples and plate onto 3 different agar types. We're using a nutrient agar, TSA, which gives us a total bacterial count. We're also using a low nutrient agar, R2A, which picks up more environmental species. And then thirdly, a blood agar, Columbia blood agar, which picks up more we can think of it as the human associated species, things that might be coming from skin, for example. The next level on is that we are going to take these same samples and carry out sequencing, which is an advanced molecular technique and really allows us to drill down as to what's specifically there. So we'll be able to see the full diversity of the bacteria. In terms of the viruses, we are using a molecular technique which allows us to detect the presence of viral particles. So it's not necessarily telling us that the virus is infective, but it will tell us whether it's present or not. This slide is really just to give an example of the kind of things that we get. So on the left-hand side, we've got a couple of schematics. We've got the lower deck and the upper deck of the bus, showing the distribution of sites that we are monitoring across the buses. We've got 26 discrete sites that we are routinely swabbing. And on the right-hand side, some examples of what we see on agar. So at the top, we have our standard nutrient agar and our low nutrient R2 agar. So we're getting our total bacterial numbers and our environmental species. And then the red looking one is Columbia blood agar, and only the species that are more associated with us, and particularly skin will grow on these. So in that way, we can start dividing up what the populations from different sites look like. So what are we finding? Again, I'm only giving a very overview sort of summary of what we're finding, but I'm happy to go into this in a little bit more detail if anyone wants to know. But we're finding that the numbers of bacteria do vary from bus to bus and from sample to sample, but in general, they are all quite low. And when I mean low, I'm talking in terms of per centimetre squared, 100 to 1,000, which in bacterial terms, if you think of those very large numbers I was talking about, are very low numbers, with the exception being areas such as the floor. That's no great surprise. You can envisage, especially if you've had things like rain and people are coming on with muddy shoes, we get much higher numbers when we sample. When we're looking at high touch point areas, which particularly through the pandemic have had higher amounts of cleaning protocols applied to them, such as grab rails, we have very low numbers or find it hard to detect any at all. And we are finding some differences in general groupings between different areas. So for example, we find that the seating has predominantly our so-called human species, while floors have predominantly our environmental species. But the real take-home message of this is that so far, no areas are really showing high levels of risk. The numbers are really what we would expect to find in a shared public space. So how can we use this information? Well, by understanding the distribution and diversity of these microbial communities, we can hopefully educate people more about risk, make that risk a real thing that people can analyze and understand. And we can also use the information to show how simple interventions, such as touchpoint cleaning, mask wearing, hand hygiene, can impact on these microbial communities and really make a difference. And all of this combined is really helping us try to move forward in making that invisible microbial world as visible as possible. So I think at this point I hand back to Charlotte.
You do. Thank you, Sandra. So working with Sandra's expertise and knowledge has pushed the rest of the team to comprehend more fully the agencies and interactivities of the bacterial and viral communities within the design of the bus and the habits of passengers, cleaners and drivers, as she maps the bacterial traces left in places less clean or ineffectively cleaned. We have been able to connect our observations of where people sit, what cleaners clean during the daytime, and what gets cleaned at night and what doesn't, with her observations. But perhaps most usefully, her findings provide us with a rich understanding of a public space and where lies greatest risk of potentially picking up harmful bacteria, and where cleaning can happen to mitigate those risks, much of which is happening already. And more generally, to ask questions about how her findings articulate a microbial geography related to bus design that may also create a particular relationship with the content of bus air and methods of refreshing it, that is to say, of letting clean air in. We are only beginning to ask the question about what might be the practices of bus passengers that alter the bus air content and air currents. So our aim in this paper is to begin to rethink affective relations that shape how bus interiors are made clean following COVID infection prevention guidance, and how this relates to the behaviour of bus passengers, drivers and cleaners in relation to risk of transmission. We consider longer term adaptations in behaviour that can improve infection prevention on public transport in a post-pandemic age. So we seek to understand the application of clinical infection prevention techniques used in the hospital to the public bus transport system, to examine how bus passengers throughout the pandemic experienced working with advice about how to prevent infection when boarding the bus, especially following the slow movement towards not only surface-based infection prevention measures, but to include viral airborne infection measures too. And how was the later advice about aerosol transmission and how to refresh or clean the air received and put into practice by bus passengers? And really to do this, we were interested in drawing upon three core bodies of literature. These were studies of infection prevention practices, cleaning and cleaning practices, and public transport behaviour and bus passenger relations. So infection prevention and control is a practical, evidence-based approach which prevents patients and health workers and increasingly wider publics from being harmed by avoidable infection. Compliance with IPC measures, including hand hygiene and mask wearing, are understood as critical to minimising the risk of COVID-19 infection. There has been changing government guidance about levels of infection prevention practice that should be adhered to by the public and in various employment and public settings beyond the wards of COVID patients. This is significant to our study as IP practices and PPE that were the preserve of a clinical setting were suddenly of interest to wider non-specialist publics. This study also speaks to how the communities we met who were bus users reacted to the introduction of IP measures into their everyday lives. So social scientific and health science scholars have used ethnographic research to understand IP practices in healthcare settings. Ethnography can assist in understanding the contextual factors that support or hinder the implementation of evidence-based practices for reducing healthcare-associated infection. It can strengthen clinicians' infection control awareness and risks realisation by engaging them in ethnographic evidence of their own infection control practices and provide practical implementation advice to hospital architecture and design to increase IP efficacy. Sustained periods of observation have revealed inconsistent adherence to recommended IP measures, including hand hygiene procedures, including during the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. Ethnographic research can also tell us much about the socio-spatial complexity, the diversity in day-to-day operation of working life in healthcare. So De Alessandro, for example, exposed shared geographies and how the absence of formal spatial segmentation for different activities contributes to the spread of microbial life. And the research team's own ethnographic research highlighted the need to understand the movement of pathogenic agents as the output of a complex interplay between objects and human touch. And these findings really matter for thinking about transmission pathways in non-clinical settings more widely. For the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a recognition that we are all in it together, that individual behaviour impacts on the collective and that every action can help. So this has necessitated the upskilling of the general public in IP protocols. Governments and NGOs have provided advice on reducing your risk of catching COVID or spreading it to other people. The UK government used the slogan "Hands, Face, Space" to communicate good infection prevention practice, and in spring of 21, fresh air was added. In 2021, following the development of the availability of the vaccine in the UK, "Get a jab" is now central to the infection prevention messaging, along with "meet outside" and "leave open doors and windows when possible." However, the urgency to the infection prevention messaging has been watered down in the UK as vaccination numbers have increased, with a populist government keen to get the economy moving again, and arguably making people not feel they need to be as anxious about getting ill because of the chance of death is drastically reduced if vaccinated. The challenge is how to support the learning and establishment of improved infection prevention practices forged during the height of the pandemic to become a lasting legacy in spaces where people mix with others from multiple households to reduce disease burden on stretched health services. Second, we have turned our attention to the making of clean and the renewed significance of domestic and commercial cleaning practices from spring 2020. Unlike much cleaning, when there can be a phenomenological and aesthetic sense of dirt or dust on a surface, the pandemic played into individual and collective anxieties of an invisible threat. This was not cleaning away of a dirt that was in the form of a change in felt texture, a whiff in the air, a grime that could be picked up on a passing damp cloth, but through cautious rinsing and lather making and the application of greasy cleaning gels, and supported by the science that everyday soap had the capacity to destroy the invisible virus. The performance and duration of cleaning addressed anxieties and cultivated hopes about making safe by making clean when an absence of scientific evidence existed about the novel virus. The social construction of dirt as an emotional, rational, moral issue with less attention to its socio-biological manifestation has created a legacy in terms of how it is managed and imagined, and which has often lacked a sensitivity to the microbiome as a precious resource. The flaws in previous approaches to dirt matters to the pandemic response, as the dirt is airborne, not sensed through smells or visuals, but in an unsensible viral load. Proxies of CO2 monitors have been one way to grapple with how to know if an enclosed space is less risky. The impoverished comprehension of the microbiome has perhaps hindered this new imaginary around the uncleanliness of transparent air, despite stories of how high concentrations of virus can linger in the air if not dispersed by air currents. Yet, as Elizabeth Shove writes, describing people, things or practices as clean or dirty is not a socially neutral enterprise, but it has belied the simplicity to making clean, avoiding the biological realities which speak affirmatively to the contrary position that healthy symbiotic relations with microbial others is both more accurate and a world we should foster, certainly not sterility. So the perceived dirtiness of others, whether they be the great unwashed or the smelly foreigners, reinforces dominant value systems. In these ways, we can see the intersections of dirt and waste with inequalities articulated through social structures around gender and class, about who cleans, how they clean, and who is dirty. Closeness to real dirt becomes analogous with moral dirt. For the working class to be clean became a sign of individual personal respectability. So using the example of Pear's soap advertisements, Coates has illustrated how cleanliness became associated with whiteness and right ways to live. And these value systems move into the airborne in the repeated urban design patterns in the UK of the wealthy living in the west of urban industrial cities and the poorer in the east, downwind of the prevailing southwesterly wind direction, and thus subject to greater polluted air. Biological security or biosecurity can involve cleaning and fumigating, but it also involves bordering practices between spaces with different hygiene levels. Within healthcare settings, there is an overwhelming consensus that environmental cleanliness is important for controlling infection. Yet Dancer argued that bacteriological standards with which to assess clinical surface hygiene in hospitals does not yet exist. Recent ethnographic research has confirmed that most near patients' surfaces are not being cleaned in accordance with existing hospital policies, and patients occupying rooms previously occupied by patients with infection are on average at 73% increased risk of acquiring the same pathogen. These findings indicate a need to understand cleaning practices and to identify how cleaning can be improved. But again, targeted cleaning seems the aim here in creating super sterile environments, such as operating theatres. But that is not the aim everywhere, nor should it be with greater understanding of maintaining a healthy microbiome. Despite the value of improved cleaning in IP, professional training in cleaning is given little attention within healthcare setting and teachings. This is despite the fact that hospitals and associated infected patients are occurring within far more complex architectures than offices or schools. So the lowly status of dirt removal does not support extensive training, and new recruits are often provided with nothing more than a perfunctory introduction to cleaning process. Little knowledge of the microbiological principles underlying hygienic practices means that key microbial reservoirs in the clinical environment go unrecognised. When cleaning does take place, research has shown that evaluation has exclusively relied on visual assessments of the cleanliness of surfaces, whether visible soilage or dust and dirt. So thirdly, we drew upon transport studies and cognate fields and their growth of interest in engagement with cultures of bus passenging. Such spaces are recognised as producing the formation of relational practices on the move, as well as temporary bodily orientations, public codes of conduct and habits. Whether it's the daily commute to work or an occasional ride to the city centre, the bus journey marks a space where interactions with unacquainted others is not only possible, but for the most part unavoidable. Such journeys are marked by the coming together of difference. The bus is a space where conversations across the difference become possible. Buses are spaces of exchange, of closeness, of propinquity, where bodies are pressed up against each other, seats are shared, and personal boundaries are constantly negotiated. Public transport settings like the bus demand a certain giving up of the self. There is no seat reservation, no real-time guarantees, no conductor. As bodies are thrown together, there is an increasing awareness of one's body in space and its relation to others. People touch knees and breathe in to let others by. Wilson recounts on the codes of conduct that take place on the bus. As the passenger groups shift with each stop, the requirements and claims to seats alter. There are clearly a series of rules that work to orientate bodies in particular ways. She also notes that there are tactics to be read. Bags, coats and feet are placed on chairs, and a quick glance may be met by a dead eye and taken as indication of hostility. As space diminishes, such strategies of deterrence become less acceptable. Furthermore, the small act of changing one's seat or gathering together the hem of one's coat so as to avoid contact with another may be read as a sign of racism or disgust, regardless of the intention. From early on in the pandemic, there was evidence that the UK COVID-19 was disproportionately affecting BAME communities. This is attributed to a variety of factors, including types of employment, inappropriate PPE at work, living in intergenerational households, and having to use public transport more than their white British counterparts. As spaces where people from different communities of the city come together in temporary proximity, the buses represent a good site for researching the cultural as well as the biological entanglements involved and bringing to focus wider issues of inequality in public spaces. Public transport has been a place in which race, religion and power have often been negotiated. From Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat in Montgomery in 1955, to the Bristol bus boycott of 1963, and to legal restrictions around the public wearing of the burqa and hijab in Western Europe. The bus is a site of everyday multiculturalism in which relational practices are performed as a part of differentiation and identity formation. For Shaker, the bus becomes an arena not only for the performative othering that Muslim people experience, but also for those subtle, unintentional embodied acts of othering that operate below the conscious perceptions and subjective emotions of travellers. Differentials in public transportation design expose spatial inequalities that literally move through the city. Through these disparities, public transportation serves as spaces where the legacies of inequalities are perpetuated. So drawing upon this literature, our research was conducted in 2 cities across the United Kingdom, Bristol and Southampton, and it really comprised of 3 phases of research. The first was the social science research strand, including approximately 50 hours of ethnography between February 21 and October 21. It involved researchers covertly observing bus use and user behaviour at bus stops, when boarding and exiting buses, and throughout their journeys on board the bus. In each city, researchers focused on one route, and these routes were selected according to their central socio-economic function, as well as their social demographics, travelling through ethnically diverse communities. Ethnographic observations fed into Sandra's microbiome study of where to sample and when. Social science research included a total of 37 semi-structured interviews lasting between 25 minutes and 1 hour. Of these, 10 were bus drivers, 5 were bus cleaners, and 22 were bus users. Interviews focused on everyday experiences of bus travel during the pandemic, feelings and anxieties around managing risk, and human interactions with microbial life. Interviewees were contacted via partner bus companies and via both male and female gatekeepers attached to the Bristol Somali Youth Forum. 27 interviews were conducted with participants who identified as BAME. Of these, 25 came through contacts with the Somali Youth Forum in Bristol. The second element of our methodological approach, as you've already heard, was a microbiome study, where researchers took and analysed swabs from a number of different sites on a bus at different points through the day and across seasons. And the third strand, which we'll hear a little bit more about later on, was the development of 4 public educational films that mix animation with live action, with the aim to really create a novel microbial aesthetic for communicating IP advice. Parts of the bus chatter about the various bus passengers' uptake of infection prevention measures. In the remaining months of this project, other informational materials about infection prevention on the bus will be produced, and a series of stakeholder focus groups to support gaining feedback and interest in the films. Over to you, Emma.
So the findings. These are the findings that we thought we'd talk about today. We have so much to talk about, really. So setting the scene. So it's a grey, mild morning in February 2021 at 11:30 a.m. in the morning. People are arriving at a bus stop. Some have a mask on their chin, others no mask, others fully masked. People arrange themselves with empty seats between them. A bag is sometimes placed on the seat to emphasise its lack of availability. This is the period when buses are running at half capacity. Seats carry stickers to explain they are out of use. A person gets up off the bus seat to stand. Do they feel only one seat between them and another in a bus shelter is not sufficient? Other people don't move to sit down on an empty seat, but stand at either end. Masks are pulled out of pockets as the bus approaches and people board. The mask rests under his chin on one man and is pulled up as he steps up onto the bus. So the buses in spring 2021 were often rather empty. Consequently, bus passengers got a lot of choice about where they could sit. And yet we noticed some repeated preferences, hot seats, as we called them, that were used more often than others. You can look on our diagram to see where they were. Namely the downstairs back row window seats and the front row seats upstairs. A new passenger arriving could be completely unaware that the air they were moving to sit in has so recently been occupied by someone coughing and sneezing. Windows were sometimes open, sometimes closed. It was rare to see anyone make an attempt to open a window or indeed close one. Indeed, some of our interviewees were not even certain how to do it when we spoke to them later on in the year. The sentiment on the bus was to maintain the status quo and don't create points of potential conflict. By April 21, the weather was improving. More people were boarding the buses, but with less stringent attention to how they wore their mask. Two ladies are chatting earnestly, and they placed the mask under their noses. A man drinks a bottle of Red Bull, sat on the back seat, right in the centre, with no mask on at all. On a previous journey, the driver had refused travel to a man holding an open can of drink. Drivers seemed to be able to direct passengers to follow the guidelines or not. They also were active at opening all windows at the start of their journey, or not. So what do we learn about the dirt and virus and surface cleaning inside the bus? We suggest firstly that viruses are ill-suited to the category of dirt. They don't smell, they are breathed out. You can't see them and know they are there once a visible or known sick person has left the place. And this raises questions about the applicability of scholarship on cleaning and dirt that seems well suited to bacterial biofilms that grow and become visible stains on various surfaces, but less suited for aerosols. So here we have one of our bus passengers, Ahmed, talking about this. For me, to be honest with you, I try to limit the thought of thinking of a bus as dirty. Generally, buses will be dirty just because of the amount of people that come in and out, and there will never be a person always on the bus just to clean a seat after everyone. Every person gets off. So what it is with me is just I try to limit my own exposure of touching every seat that's near me, so I'm not leaving dirt on the bus for the next person. Moving on to Musa speaking now. Before lockdown, sometimes people would leave their rubbish because there's more people on there not respecting it. But now it's more like they look after the buses more because of the COVID. They put protocols in place. The cleaning has very often been framed in relation to dirt. Mary Douglas famously called dirt as matter out of place. But the dirt that Ahmed describes seems to be microbial surface-based traces of people, not airborne traces. And for Musa, it was litter. Passenger Arif even draws a distinction between the clean bus and the virus. The buses seemed like they were clean, but I just worry about the virus. The virus is immaterial, not matter, and the concept of it being out of place does not seem to tally either with experiences of transmission risk. Indeed, both its invisibility and its transmissibility in aerosol form, hanging within air, not settled on the terrestrial earth, make it hard to place, to locate, to tether. Rather, it floats. It gets carried along by invisible forces in the air, eddies, gusts. The aerographies of cleaning require tactics that challenge the terrestrial techniques of cleaning, the wiping, the brushing, the polishing, the rinsing, the agitating soap to make foam to destroy it. Nevertheless, our findings show that there is strong popular belief in the value of hand washing and surface cleaning to prevent infections, a belief quite deeply embedded in a cultural understanding of medicine and biosecurity. These practices perform easier to understand interactions with real or imagined settled static microbes, which are too small for most of us to see, through the use of scrubbing, water, and the application of soap. We have seen on public transport and in other spaces the bus company performing infection prevention measures such as grab rail cleaning at different time points in the day, previously restricted practice to clinical settings. Indeed, initial findings of our swabbing of the recently cleaned bus showed levels of cleanliness comparable to a hospital ward. This is Hassan, a driver, speaking here. Majority of them, cleaners, is they need to basically clean the floors, but we have also cleaners at the bus stops, basically, like in town, where when a bus has a little time, they come and there's some cleaners. So who has the cleaning equipment, and they clean it and they go. In some instances, these performances become exaggerated, distorted, or misguided, as in the hygiene theatre of visible measures that do little to reduce actual risk. We might think of hand gels and signage at the entrances of buildings with closed windows or perspex screens that customers talk around rather than through, reassuring performances for the audience of customers or employees rather than engagements with the viral actors or infection. And while it's true that some of these measures have a practical function, which they may or may not effectively fulfill, they also serve as a symbolic one to remind us that we're still in the midst of a pandemic in which SARS-CoV-2 is circulating and in which bodies remain at ever varying levels of risk. But not everyone sees the cleaners. As Yasmin says, since COVID, from the beginning till now, I've never seen any cleaner on the bus, never. And equally, people may not see the small signs to keep the windows open to let fresh air in, helpfully stuck on any bus window that can be opened. Wooden blocks were stuck with glue on some windows to force them to be kept open, but the bus company manager said passengers pulled them off. For those anxious and looking out for reassurance, they perform in a particular way, but not everyone is engaged. Ahmed says, I'm not sure, I've seen if more windows are opened, I haven't noticed that. So moving on to now cleaning the air. So people and non-humans are frequently sharing materialities with others, and what is carried in shared air is formed by those we share it with. Trees in blossom sending pollen on the breeze, microparticles from slowly wearing down car tires and brake pads, and most pertinent to the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, the exhalations and inhalations of viral load moving from one body to another. But this has raised questions about how we secure the body in response to external atmospheric threats, both the real and imagined proximity of the virus. It has also necessitated reflecting more broadly about how to care for self, others, human and non-human, through behaviour changes that can secure the body and prevent infection from potential external threats in the air. The method of cleaning unwanted airborne invisible particles expelled by an infectious bus passenger demands a very different strategy to traditional cleaning practices. And while regular surface cleaning in commercial spaces like the bus has maintained a prominence in our study, the bus companies have been very keen to tell us about the ozoning of buses, where there's been a palpable risk of COVID virus being on board. There is no human cleaner scrubbing or wiping over surfaces with antibacterial spray. Here, the air is cleansed by mechanical fumigation. This is Hassan speaking, but if a passenger comes on and does something or spits or whatever or throws up, we'll take the whole bus back to the depot and it has to be COVID cleaned, which we understand as this ozoning. However, one infection prevention measure that is still less well practiced and understood as an air cleaning practice through dispersing concentrations of an airborne, non-smelly, invisible, insensible threat is the importance of ventilation. The struggle to grasp the significance of ventilation, we think, is linked to the much poorer general cultural understanding of what is always carried in the air that is barely sensed by perhaps a sneeze or at worst itchy eyes. These are floating viruses, bacteria, fungal spores, dust and pollen. And Aisha speaks to us a lot about this. So you're relating that sense of a smell of the bus with the risk of COVID, I ask. No, even before it smelled bad, I think it's just some people are not hygienic and they just come in, and I just don't like being that close to people in general. And then if they smell bad, it just makes me more uncomfortable. Sensory reminders like smell can create effective relations that move people to do something. But where there's an absence of effective reminders or the presence of an airborne risk, this is where creativity is required about how to grapple with novel landscapes of human viral interaction, or some people may imagine and develop their own personal effective cues for risk. like stuffy air, you can't breathe in. My sister said the air was making her nose feel itchy, so something like that would make me feel as well. There's a virus in the bus. I think science, invisible science, or some actual things I can see, I think it's transmitted through the breath. That's how I always like usually when somebody's ill, they can feel it themselves. They have like a hot breath. So how different respiratory publics are constituted through the air that they breathe, what it contains, and what they do or don't imagine, what it does or doesn't contain, and perhaps most importantly, how they coordinate around a set of shared beliefs and understandings is highly significant for the role ventilation can have in infection prevention strategies. There's a cultural history around keeping windows closed if you're feeling ill, to stay warm and not catch cold. The new messaging to keep windows open for ventilation runs counter to that belief, and this came up in our interviews. Before COVID, I've been on a bus when the bus is all full, it's hot and humid, but yet once you open the window, people shout at you just because, oh yeah, it's too cold. But yet there's so many body heat there, and yet you have to try to get some fresh air. Do you feel warm or cold on the bus? Neither, to be honest. The windows are, I think, open most of the time. Does that clear the horrible smell at all? No, because people just close it. Some are closed, some are open. Can you see that there are problems keeping the windows open for some people? Yeah, definitely, says Jasmine. Like especially, I don't know, some people, they feel cold and some people, they're not feeling well. But I think it would be good for people, that have like asthma and stuff like that. I think it could be helpful for them. It's easy to imagine the person who's feeling ill, a little feverish, who would not want windows to be open because of the challenge of managing their thermoregulation. Passengers spoke about favouring the seats that are on top of the warm bus engine at the back of the bus in the winter. Yet to reduce airborne infections like COVID, appealing to an apprehension that a cool breeze running through the bus is positive is a big switch in established cultural thought. So to conclude, we suggest that the pandemic has brought into focus the existence of a not fully comprehensible sensed threat in what is carried in and out of our bodies through the air that we breathe. And that this threat is still one that is poorly attended to by many. And indeed, there are actually cultural contradictions about the role of airflow in infection prevention. There are barriers to the ability for bus users to adhere to good infection prevention. Not only, and these can only add to existing factors that reproduce inequalities related to mobilities, race and class. It's almost like IP is now added to that. So there's more work is needed in the study of applying infection prevention expertise to non-clinical settings that works with the microbiome as a valuable resource. But I think what we feel is the greatest challenge is to support this rethinking of effective relations with air, breathing and airborne disease agents in relation to making concepts of cleaning and dirty relevant to aerography. So now over to Paul, because I think he's going to now show these films with a very brief introduction.
Super, thank you, Emma. Yeah, so a key output of the research is the production of 4 short films that are aimed at increasing passenger engagement or understanding around the importance of infection prevention and supporting confidence in bus travel for the bus industry. Because if care is taken, the bus is theoretically not a risky environment, and travelling is not a risky thing to do. And so we had a lot of collaborative discussions across the team from the outset of the project. And as the ethnographic and microbiological research was undertaken, we worked with a professional filmmaker and we worked in dialogue with various stakeholders. And through this process, we developed a set of aesthetic parameters for the creation of these films. So the first was to represent human and microbial communities on the bus, and to focus on the non-human characters was a challenge that we decided to take. We decided to use humour instead of shock tactics or didacticism, like we've seen quite a lot of that in formal public health communication. So we wanted to try something different, more creative. We want to create kind of positive rather than negative messaging. So to kind of reinforce what we saw as positive behaviours or positive infection prevention behaviours. We didn't want to anthropomorphize microbes as individuals, nor did we want to kind of monsterize them like the little kind of domestos bleach monsters that you see jumping out of the toilet at you. You know, that's been done as well, and we know that doesn't kind of link to the reality of what microbial communities are. And we wanted to somehow acknowledge microbes' invisibility to humans, but we knew that we also somehow had to kind of represent those microbial communities. So we set ourselves a really, really difficult task. And we also, as I was sort of listening to everyone speak earlier, was thinking that we also ought to remember that we didn't want to particularly represent human characters, but we didn't want to be kind of judgmental about human characters or reinforce any narratives about different humans on the bus being dirty or being irresponsible, or, you know, any of those kind of judgmental issues around human communities. And we wanted to create some material that was relevant not only for the COVID-19 pandemic, but that also had kind of application for, you know, the kind of potential rise in other colds, flus, viruses that we're seeing already, and will continue to do in future, and antimicrobial resistance as well is something that we've touched on before. So, you know, thinking of something that perhaps has relevance beyond COVID-19. So I'm going to show you in just a moment these 4 videos that will just run straight after each other, that are kind of loosely based around fresh air, mask wearing, an idea of being kind of bus kind, so thinking about that sort of relational practices between human bus passengers. And the final film, the most ambitious and most difficult film, is about kind of reflecting our continued interaction with microbial worlds, which we call micro passengers, that travel on the humans and that travel on the bus as well. Great. And the film series, I should say, is called You're Never Alone on the
Bus. A bit chilly today.
Yeah, that one wants to shut me up.
You do go on a bit.
No, they want to shut the window.
There is a bit of a breeze.
But you got to keep me open. Keep the bus breathing. You air in, hold air out.
Yeah, fresh air shows you care.
Even in the winter.
Okay, ready?
2 masks, 2 points.
Ooh, he's going for his phone. Will he? Won't he?
He kept his mask on!
That's an extra point. Uh-oh, now we've got a sneezer coming down.
Interesting. Very interesting.
She's caught it in the mask! What a hero!
That's what you call using your head.
To stop the spread.
You okay?
Yeah.
Exhausting sometimes though, isn't it?
Yeah, good to be busy though, eh?
Yeah, good to see people out and about again as well.
Nice to give a bit of space too.
Yeah, leave some breathing space, just in case.
A bit of kindness goes a long way.
And there's still a long way to go. Oh, hello. Where did you get on? I've not met you before.
Hey, Sammy. Who are you talking to?
To my pet micro passengers. I've got quite a lot on me now.
Us too. They're mostly nice though.
I like them.
I don't.
Oh, here it comes. That feels better.
I think I've got a stinky one.
I didn't want to say anything,
I can't smell anything. I'm just chilling with my pet micro passengers. But these guys get a good clean because human hands touch them.
No micro pets allowed.
Like on us, right? Oh yeah.
Feeling fresh.
Looking good.
Let's see who gets on next.
And see if they can't keep their micro passengers to themselves.
Great. I should have said that was the world premiere of those films, actually. Not quite finished. Not quite the final cut of some of the animation on the last two, but yeah. So we just thought tonight would be a good opportunity to share them with you, and yeah, we'd love to hear any feedback on those, as well as any other questions or comments anybody has. So if I could hand back over to you.
Great, fantastic, thank you. Yeah, the round of applause. What an extraordinary project. I think what's fascinating, just for I'm sorry, I will allow people to ask questions, but I'm just rambling a bit from my take on it, was just the extraordinary range of different languages in that interdisciplinary group, isn't it? Because and the whole, you know, from Sandra's like hard science, you know, I've got different types of agar, you know, the growth of the microbes, to those really complex and interesting, interweaving aspects of social cultural behaviours that Charlotte is talking about. And my work happens to be in homelessness. So when you mentioned your thing about the great unwashed and the images of morality linked to cleanliness, you know, it chimes very much with issues that relate to my research. And then there's ethnographic research, you know, through the web of it, and it ends with, because it's a practical project, isn't it? You're not, you know, curiously exploring a phenomenon. You're also trying to address an issue of public health, aren't you? So it ends with. I'm delighted, by the way. I'm chuffed. You know, Pandemic Perspectives was the world premiere of your videos. You know, this is a coup for us. So thanks ever so much.